Well, many of the survivors wouldn't speak about it at all. Quite a number of them found it just too painful to recall the night that their father or their loved one passed. But those who did speak about it, gosh, it gave you goosebumps to listen to them. The one story that I remember, perhaps the best of all, was the story of a fellow named Frank Philip Axe, AKS, and he lived in Norfolk, Virginia. And Frank was 10 months old at the time, and he was traveling with his 16-year-old mother to America to join Mr. Axe, who was already in Virginia. And the story, as he told it, was, I think, one of the most amazing stories of leaving a ship that I've ever heard. Mrs. Axe had gone up on deck, very confused, not knowing quite what to do. They were traveling in third class. There was no alarm bell sounding to tell them there was imminent danger. Just a steward came knocking, pounding on the door saying, "Go up on deck with your life belt." And Mrs. Axe was there with her baby in her arms, and an officer came by yelling, "Women and children to the boats." And apparently that enraged this man who was standing nearby, because essentially he was being told, "There's no chance for you. Don't even try for a place in the boat." And so in a fit of anger, he goes, "Women and children first? I'll show you women and children first." And he snatched Frank out of his mother's arms and tossed him over the railing. And luckily, at that exact spot, a lifeboat was in the process of descending down Titanic's side, and little Frank came whistling down out of the nighttime sky and landed right in the lap of a woman in the lifeboat. And Mrs. Axe thought that she had just witnessed the murder of her son. She was absolutely devastated, wouldn't get into the lifeboat because she couldn't bear the idea of telling Mr. Axe what had happened to their son. And eventually a bunch of people kind of ganged up on her and put her into a boat on the opposite side of the ship. And during the night, they drifted apart. And when they reached the rescue ship, Mrs. Axe was inconsolable. And the woman who had Frank was taking care of him, apparently. And the day before Carpathia reached New York, the cabin in which Mrs. Axe had been placed, the occupant, Mrs. Cook, suggested that she go up on deck and get some fresh air. And while she was up on deck, she heard a baby crying, and lo and behold, it was Frank. But the problem was that the lady who caught Frank was now claiming him to be her own and wouldn't give him up. So the two ladies were drawn to Captain Rostron, and the story goes that he said, "Ladies, what am I to do? How do I decide whose baby this is?" And Mrs. Axe said to Captain Rostron, "Captain, if you look under my child's left arm, you'll find a strawberry-colored birthmark. And that's a tiny little detail that only a mother would know." And Frank was restored to his mother. So that was, I think, one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. I think there are really two reasons for it. First of all, I think somewhere in Titanic's passenger list, we probably find someone a lot like ourselves, and we tend to look at the disaster through their viewpoint if they indeed spoke about it afterwards, or we put ourselves in their place. I often related to Lawrence Beasley, who was a second-class passenger, and he was a school teacher as I was, and he wrote one of the best accounts of the disaster that has ever been written. So I think that's part of it. We see ourselves on Titanic. I think another reason, and it's associated with that, is that the people of Titanic, because they are like ourselves, teach us about a time period when selflessness was very, very evident. When you see people stepping back from the lifeboats to allow other people to get in today's world, we honestly wonder whether that would happen again. And so we are drawn, I think, very powerfully to the sacrifice that people made so that others might live. And we saw a similar behavior when the World Trade Center in New York City was destroyed. People giving up their lives trying to help others down the stairways of the World Trade Center. So that's a timeless element of human behavior, and Titanic expressed that so very, very well. And I think the other aspect of it is that here we are 100 years later, and we're still learning all sorts of new things about the people who were on board and also about the ship itself. And science is unlocking a lot of secrets about Titanic. The 2010 expedition created the most detailed map of the entire wreck site, and it's going to be fascinating to study that. It has examined the Titanic photographically in high resolution, high detail photography that, again, is going to show not only details of the ship's current state, but probably gives some pretty good indication of what the ship's future will be and how soon that future will occur. So the story is not finished. There's 100 years of story there, but there's still new chapters to be written. For the people of Attergool, and indeed all of the third-class passengers, the crossing on Titanic must have been a remarkable experience. Leaving their town, I'm sure, must have been a very bittersweet experience, because on the one hand, they were dealing with tremendous poverty and deprivation. The times in Ireland were very, very tough in those days. And so there was a tremendous optimism about coming to America, the land of opportunity, and carving out a new life. But yet, by the same token, it was leaving behind everything they knew. Family, friends, their entire orbit of life was now going to be changed. So when you come on board a ship in that situation, you probably have a great deal of fear in your heart. And once they are on board the Titanic, they see wondrous things that they had never encountered before. People serving them at the various meals, electric lights, flush toilets. There was, for the first time in their lives, there was live entertainment on board in the form of a piano in the third-class lounge. And if someone knew how to play it, there would be entertainment. We know of an Irishman named Eugene Daly who had brought his Uilleann pipes with him and was serenading the passengers, and they were dancing in steerage. It was almost like being in an Irish village on the Titanic. And so I'm sure that the conditions on board the ship for the first 4 nights were a combination of amazing new things, new foods that they had probably never had before, and also a kind of a reassuring concept that they were with others of their own kind. They all had this common bond of looking forward to life in the new world. And to have all of that come crashing down about them 4 nights later, I think is one of the great tragedies of that night.
Well, my interest is people. And to me, history is people. There's no story without the people element. People make history. And the same thing is true of the Titanic disaster. You start with a ship, you have an unfortunate incident that happened to that ship, but the story is how the people react to the situation, whether or not they're able to survive or not, and what they do, what their behavior is like during that time period. Fortunately, Titanic, you had approximately 2.5 hours of coverage or of live reaction of people before the ship went down. So you have a story there that in a ship like the Lusitania, you don't have, because the Lusitania went down in 10 minutes. So Titanic, not only because of the time factor, but because also of the fact there were so many wealthy, well-known people on board that were known throughout the world and had tremendous influence at that time period, were on board, and there was a lot of interest in that. And so these were some of the reasons. In addition, the ship was the most luxurious, most modern ship of its time, the largest object that existed at that time. And people were fascinated with it. And it was actually said to be unsinkable. And a lot of people thought that was sacrilegious, kind of throwing this in the face of God, and said they will rue the day. Now, that's another factor that in this story that people feel, many people feel. There were just so many, the iceberg hit the Titanic in the only possible way that ship could have been injured and sunk. If it would have hit head on, it would have gone back to Belfast for repairs. The first watertight compartment might have flooded, maybe the second, but it would have floated. They would have taken it back to Belfast. Probably no loss of life or very little loss of life, and the ship would have survived because they turned it just enough that the iceberg managed to scrape the underside of Titanic. It did pop a couple of holes, but the real injury was the pressure that broke the rivets, and the plates parted. And when the plates parted, water started seeping in at quite a brisk rate. So Titanic's hours were numbered. Originally, I think Thomas Andrews said 1 hour, maybe at most 2, and they did get 2.5 hours. Fortunately, they did get the lifeboats off, except for collapsibles A and B that they were in the process of getting off when Titanic went down. The people that were trying to get into those boats were washed overboard. Some of them managed to cling to those boats and were later picked up, but very few people that ended up in the water were survivors. We're talking about maybe 24 at most. And the reason being, the water was so cold, well below freezing. People did not die by drowning, as many people think. Most of them had life belts on. They were above the level of the water, and the water was pretty clear that night, pretty calm. The problem was, the water was so cold, they died of hypothermia, and died probably within 10 or 15 minutes at most of the time they went in the water. So very few survived from the water itself. If they were in a lifeboat, they were freezing cold, but they survived. If they were in the water, not so. I like to say that in Titanic, you saw 2 types of people. I call them the true survivors and the wallowers. Now, the wallowers are those people that cannot handle adversity in life. And Titanic was a tremendous disaster in their lives, tremendous adversity. And many of them never survived that. They couldn't handle a marriage. They couldn't handle jobs. They couldn't handle just life in general. And as a result, they had very unhappy lives. Some committed suicide. Some got into the wrong side of the law and had problems with the law, ended up in prison. Many things happened in life to these people that they couldn't handle, and they died relatively young. Many committed suicide. Then there are the true survivors, and when you think of Titanic having just slightly over 700 survivors, and yet 7 of those survivors lived to be over 100 years old. Now, when most of them died prior to 1970, that is a high statistic in this country, very high. And then you get into the 90s, and you have almost 100 that lived into their 90s. This is out of 700 people. That's unbelievable. And then in their 80s, another 150 to 200. So these people lived long lives. They lived, though many of them never became famous in life, they had tremendous families. they succeeded in what they did, whether it was just raising a family or whether it was in making a very, very financially secure living for themselves. So Titanic created quite a few true survivors, and so many of these people, I really think of them as true successes in life. And they probably were more successful than they would have been if they hadn't had this experience. One thing about Titanic, it's the only ship known where the passengers that survived the Titanic disaster never went through the normal channels at Ellis Island. They were allowed to land, and not to say that there were no records kept of them, because they were on board the Carpathia. All the information had to be recorded on each one, and they had to have the right numbers and so on, but they never had to officially go through Ellis Island channels. Contrary to the story that comes out that third-class passengers were behind locked doors down in the depths of the ship and had no chance to get on deck, there's no proof of that. There were no floor-to-ceiling gates of any kind on the ship. There were gates that went maybe chest high at most between second class and third class, or first class and third class, but they could have been easily scaled. They weren't scaled because the third class passengers knew their place was below those gates. So it wasn't until probably at the very end that they were panic-stricken and really tried to get over those, which was easily done. And a lot of them talk about going through first and second class deck space, going through the dining rooms and so on to get to the boat deck. So we know that happened. In what quantity, that you don't know. The Titanic tragedy could have been twice as bad in terms of fatalities had it been full. Now, contrary to belief that everyone was doing everything they could to sail on Titanic, it was only about half full in all three classes to what they could have had as passengers in first, second, and third class. There could have been equally as many as were on board, more. And I guess it's very fortunate that this was not the case, because that would not have been true of the lifeboats. The lifeboats, the same number, and there would have been nothing for these people, the additional people that would have been on board. But despite their ad campaigns throughout Europe, and there were many first-class passengers that did change accommodations to take ship on Titanic, the most luxurious, the largest ship at that time. But there were a lot of others that canceled ship or were going to travel on it and had second thoughts because of this whole idea of not sailing on the maiden voyages of ships that hadn't been proven yet. So first class, half the accommodations went unused. Second class the same, and third class the same.